Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I've had people ask me a few questions about the style of deadlifting I'm doing lately in my training videos, and one of the big questions I'm getting is why are my toes pointed out on a conventional deadlift? So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skill on my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Actually guys, what I'm doing on the deadlift is actually a very traditional deadlift stance. A lot of guys who were pulling 700 plus pounds decades ago used a stance like that. A lot of it just has to do with moment, arms, shear stress, and an efficient line of pull. Now obviously I'm doing things the hard way because right now I'm pulling beltless, working on my hook grip. Everything's being pulled with a hook grip, and I'm in squat shoes. I'm in weightlifting shoes to create a little bit of a deficit to make it harder to force me to learn to get tighter at the bottom and find efficient leverages. What it comes down to, one of the big advantages I believe that sumo has, so when people talk about stuff like sumo having certain advantages and for some people over conventional, a lot of it has to do with the ability to pull in a straight line. And that ability to pull in a straight line affects shear stress on the lower back. And what people need to remember, the deadlift is difficult. The deadlift in the front is difficult for a reason. You know, it's like you see people start messing with these hack deadlifts and behind the back deadlifts, whatever you want to call them. I don't care what people call them. And a lot of people can lift 200 plus more pounds that way. And that's because of the awkward angle of the deadlift. The deadlift is an awkward movement. Yes, it's an amazing exercise, but it's awkward. And a lot of it is because you don't have a weight squarely centered. You know, it's not in your center of gravity. You have to adjust your body to keep it to the center of gravity, and if you're not careful, that creates shear stress on your lower back. You know, when people talk about injuries in their lower back, I always say stuff like, yes, the touch and go deadlifts cause that, but oftentimes that's also combined with excessive shear stress due to the technique that they use in that bouncing it off the floor when their lower back is really in a very forward position. And what you ultimately find, little bitty things can help keep that bar at least mid-foot. And so one of the things that I do is I have my heels in fairly close and I have my toes turned out. Why? Because that lets me get my arms closer together, right? In other words, my arms aren't splayed out like on a snatch grip deadlift. I can have them straight up and down with my shoulders, and they stay behind the knees. In other words, my arms don't drift out in front of my knees during the pull if I do it, if I execute it correctly. And because my knees have an outward angle, it's easier for me to get the bar past the knee. Think about, you guys know how a triangle works, a hypotenuse, right? If you're like this with your toes, you know, the bar is going to be up here. And if you turn your knees out, you create like this, what happens? Your knees come further back. If your knees are further back, at the point where the bar needs to start clearing the knee, what happens? You're going to be able to keep the bar closer into your center of gravity. If the bar is closer in with your center of gravity, it's going to be not only a more efficient line of pull, but it's going to make a difference. If you can have that bar 1 inch further back, when you reach the point where it has to be out the most in front of you, which would be as it's trying to clear the knee, what does that do to the lower back angle? It's going to give you a slightly more upright lower back angle, which means the weight on the bar, whether it's 400, 500, 700 pounds, is it makes it more of a compressive stress instead of a shear stress on your lower back. Which of those two would you rather have? The reason people always say that you can recover easier, there are experts who have people train the sumo deadlift instead of the conventional because they feel it's easier to recover from. Yeah, it's easier to recover from on the lower back just because of the stress difference. This is not to say that you don't get a lot of lower back stress. I mean, even doing a conventional like this, you're still going to have a slightly different low back angle than you would on sumo, but you are able to maintain a better lower back angle. And if you do some thoracic rounding a little bit like I do, that can make that more pronounced in certain ways. That can actually help you keep the lower back a little more upright. You get a little less compressive stress on your lumbar, or a little less shear stress. And that can make a big difference when we're talking about leverages here. So a lot of it has to do with just slightly reducing certain recovery problems, slightly reducing one of the concerns of injury with the lower back, right? We're just finding more efficient leverages. And guys, you got to remember the deadlift is heavy enough, and particularly you start doing stuff like mild deficit deadlifts or deadlifting in shoes like I'm doing, the deadlift is heavy enough. You don't need to put yourself at a disadvantage position because you saw some power lifter do it a certain way. People need to remember a lot of your power lifters out there who are maybe really strong squatters and benchers in their deadlift sufferers, you'll notice they have to use a really wide stance for conventional. It's because they're fat. It's because that belly gets in the way, right? That belly gets in the way. What I'm suggesting is that for people who might not have a big belly, you're going to have a lot more options for your foot position. That slightly wider stance that you see with the toes forward and everything that you see a lot of power lifters using was developed because that's what they had to do to reach down and pull correctly for guys who were fat. Because there were a lot of fat strongmen, a lot of fat power lifters back in the day. All your strongman competitors are still fat for the most part, with a few exceptions. So most of your super heavyweight power lifters are very fat. And notice what they have to do. Look how different their technique looks. And what you have is that you have tons of people who don't have the big belly who have imitated their techniques over the years. I'm not saying you can't pull a lot of weight. There are plenty of guys pulling big weights who don't have to use that position just because they've trained it that way. But they might be pulling 5 pounds more. They might be pulling 10 pounds more with a totally different footing. So a lot of it has to do with creating the right angles. And people will say stuff like, well, you know, don't you reduce the range of motion a little bit if you bring your feet out? No, you don't. Because the further you bring your feet out, the wider you have to make your grip width. So if you're out here, see that? That's totally different. That's creating a shorter situation. Your arms are higher up from the ground. So in other words, you have to be more bent over. You're creating a longer range of motion. When you're perfectly like this, when you're 90 degrees from the floor, which requires a relatively narrow stance, and I have really wide shoulders, and for me that requires a fairly narrow stance. It means the heels, because the hips and the thighs need to be in relatively tight, but you can still get the knees out in front of your hands by having the toes out. So you can kind of create the best of both worlds there by doing that. You can allow yourself to get some slightly better leverages. And again, it's about less stress on the lower back more than anything for me. So that's ultimately what I'm doing with it. That's what I'm doing. That's why I'm doing it. It's just about finding ideal leverages, looking at all the moment arms in your body. And not everyone would necessarily be built to do that. If you're pretty fat, you're going to struggle to do it that way. But I'm at a point where I don't have a gut, I don't have a belly. I have no problem using a stance like that. And that's a good thing. I mean, that's really that's our ideal world. If we're going to be healthy, fit, athletic, we want to be leaner anyways. We don't want to be fat. We don't want to be 25, 30, 35% body fat. And so then we have more tools available to us also in terms of footing, stance, finding levers and everything. We're not forced into a certain position because of body type. And again, I think that's what people need to remember, that what has become more common with the conventional deadlift, in my opinion, developed largely due to fat powerlifters and fat strongmen having to do it that way because of their belly getting in the way. It's really not necessarily ideal, but then it's become popularized, and then, you know, more and more people imitated that. Whereas then when you used to see a lot of guys pull really big weight with almost a frog situation to where their heels are together. And it's actually never a real disadvantage to doing that. There's a disadvantage of bringing your feet out wider. It might be better for your legs for the pull, but again, you're creating a longer range of motion because the further your stance starts to get, the more your arms have to come out. And it starts turning into, like when we do a snatch grip deadlift, you're doing as a deficit. It's creating more range of motion. Whereas if you just learn to pull that way that's efficient all the time, if you want to add range of motion, you can use shoes that add range of motion. You can stand on plates to add range of motion. Right? You can do these other things if you want to train a deficit to get that slightly longer range of motion for better hypertrophy, to learn to get tighter, to pop off the floor more. This is stuff that you can do with other things without necessarily having to adjust your actual technique so that you can get used to pulling really efficiently all the time. Because like I said already, guys, the deadlift is hard enough the deadlift is hard enough without making it more inefficient or putting more stress and things on your lower back. It's not necessary to do that. And I would say it's not even desirable to do that if you want to pull really, really heavy weights for a long time. I don't want to be 50 years old. I'm 41 now. I'm going to turn 42 this year. I don't want to be 50 and not be able to deadlift 500 pounds. That's not what I want, right? We need to be thinking in those terms as far as the way a lot of these moment arms affect stress in our body over the years and years of training. And I think that stances like that do matter over the years. If you're just going to keep pulling and pulling and pulling heavy, you need to be thinking about stuff like that. And I think little minor tweaks like that can make a difference over time, just getting those better leverages so that we don't beat up certain parts of our body as much, so that we don't have to beat them up in order to keep pulling heavy. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.